Hi, it's Jason. Today I'll be reading Floki's Army, Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. Chapter 2. And then it started. About a year and a half after she started working at the farm, she came to work and went to the barn and started her chores as usual. Shortly after she started feeding the dogs, she heard Creepy Guy yell. "You little son of a bitch," he hollered. She turned towards the commotion and she saw the Creepy Guy throw Little Fighter into his cage while yelling, "You little bastard!" He was holding his fingers and cursing like a madman. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she yelled. "Don't you ever do that to him again." "The little bastard bit me, that's what happened." "Well, then you must have done something to scare him first," she screamed. Her fists were clenched. She had no idea what she was planning to do, but she was so mad she could see nothing but his face. "Get out of my way, you jerk. I need to see if he's okay. Don't push me, little lady. You have no idea what I'm capable of." Just then Ned came running in. "What is going on here?" "He threw Little Fighter into his cage and I think he may be hurt." She realized that she was still yelling. "The little bastard bit me, Ned, and it's a pretty good one too," said Creepy Guy. Blood was now dripping from Creepy Guy's fingers. She couldn't help but smile inside even though she knew it was wrong. "Young lady, put that dog down and get back to work. And you," he said to Creepy Guy, "go to the house, wash your hand, and there are some Band-Aids in the cabinet. I want both of you back to work. Just stay away from each other. If this happens again, you're both fired." Of course, at the end of her shift, she wanted to speak with her uncle. Why would that jerk ever have to touch Little Fighter, she asked. Why couldn't he just do his job and leave the dogs alone? "He was doing his job," Ned said. "Little Fighter is now old enough to start breeding. We took him out of his cage to extract semen from him. We will start using it to artificially inseminate a couple of the females. His puppies will be beautiful and make me a lot of money, which means I can afford to keep paying you." "Well, why would Little Fighter have bitten him?" she questioned. "Well," said Ned, "it's not a pleasant experience for the dogs, but they usually get used to it. This was Little Fighter's first time, and as you may have guessed, it's not easy to find a person to do this kind of work. Sometimes it gets a little rough, and I need a guy who just doesn't care." Now you may understand things a little bit better. On the brighter side, Ned was trying to cheer her up. Not really his strong suit. "It looks like you gave that Little Fighter the right name. I think I will start calling him that myself." He never did. Instead, he put a collar on him with the label on it that read, ST5. For now, this was part of her life. She needed the money. Sometimes she used it to purchase things that she normally asked her parents for. She knew they were doing the best that they could, but times were tough and she didn't want to make them any tougher for her parents. She knew that there would be a day when she would be leaving, whether for a job or a school. Even though she was a top student, school wasn't likely. She would have no problem getting in with the grades, but she wasn't likely to get a full ride scholarship, and that's what it would take. What was going to happen to Little Fighter and the rest of the dogs as she went away? She had to try to erase that thought from her mind. Her father taught her that there was no sense in worrying about the things that you cannot change. He said it only gets in the way of the things that you can change. She would just do the best that she could while she was there and hope for the best. After all, it was Uncle Ned's business and he could run it any way that he liked. Going to the farm on Saturdays was just routine now. It is amazing what she could adjust to, since she had no choice. She would always keep an eye on Creepy Guy, though. He couldn't be trusted, and he was the type of guy that held a grudge. He was never going to forget the little fighter bit him, or that she challenged him. He wasn't too smart, and that made him impossible to reason with. She wished Uncle Ned would fire him. She really didn't care what happened to him, as long as he was gone. Yet Ned felt some responsibility to him, so that was never going to happen. Sometimes she thought of asking Uncle Ned if she could take Little Fighter home. It was more like a daydream because she knew what Ned's answer would be. As Uncle Ned predicted, Little Fighter's puppies were very popular. No matter what female Shih Tzu that was artificially inseminated with his semen, the puppies seemed to always be beautiful. He may have even been bred with his mother. She was never going to ask Uncle Ned because she didn't want to know. Even though inside she did know. Little Fighter was now the only male Shih Tzu on the farm. Ned didn't like to breed the long-coated breeds that much because the fur got matted with the poop they'd been forced to lie in until the cages were cleaned on Saturday. This was an experiment for Ned, and it paid off nicely. He would just use trimmers a couple times a year and cut the poop-laden fur off. Otherwise, they were disgusting to handle. She was at the farm less than once a week anymore, so it didn't bring her down as much, but she couldn't help thinking about Little Fighter. He was alone in that tiny cage all day, every day. He heard other dogs barking all day, but they weren't barks of happiness. They were barks of boredom or fear or loneliness. He never had any positive interactions with humans, even though he was supposedly man's best friend. Sometimes she wished she had never gone to Ned's farm. It would have been much better had she never met Little Fighter. Or did she mean ST5? There was never going to be a way to walk away from this feeling good. Now she was in high school. Her school activities and her social life became top priority. She spent less and less time at the farm, and therefore spent less time thinking about it. Her dad was working more consistently, so the need for money wasn't as great. Being a teenager, she was consumed with her life and having fun. She would only go to the farm if she absolutely had nothing else going on. She continued to flourish in high school with her grades and activities. In a way, it seemed pointless because there was no way her parents could send her to college. That point of view changed a little late into her senior year. Her school counselor called her into his office one day. He had always been seeing great potential in her and helped guide her as much as possible. He wanted to know if she had any plans after high school, and if so, what were they? He knew full well that her family could not afford college for her. Sheepishly, she admitted she had no plans. Maybe she would apply for a job as a bagger at the local supermarket. She had such ambitions, but nowhere to go with it. Opportunities were hard to come by in that county. What would you be willing to do for a great opportunity after you graduate? Her counselor asked. I would do just about anything, she replied. I may have something for you, he said. You must keep this between us. Of course, you'll need to talk to your parents, but until we know for sure, we need to keep it amongst ourselves. She was having a hard time listening to the blah, blah, blah. She wanted to know more. Tell me what it is, she said, in the most controlled fashion she could muster. Well, he said, I have a cousin who owns an insurance agency in Knoxville. I told him about you and how smart you are. He said that he would be willing to give you a job as a receptionist in his office, and if things worked out, he will help you get your license so that you can become an insurance agent. He also said that his wife could put you up for a few months until you save money for your own apartment. In exchange, you would babysit every now and then. I know this is a lot at once, but what do you think? He asked. It sounds really exciting, she said. I don't know much about insurance, but I do know that everyone needs it. How would I even get there? Knoxville is pretty far from here. "I could take you the first time with your parents," he replied. "That way I could make the introduction and you won't have to be so nervous. After that, you would have to take the bus if you wanted to come home and visit. It would almost be like going away to college." It didn't take long to convince her parents this was a much better opportunity than she could have if she stayed around here. Over the past 4 years, they got to know her counselor pretty well. They trusted him, and they knew his intentions were good. If for any reasons things didn't go well, she could always come back home. The school year ended, and it was now time to move on. She was so excited. She would be making money and soon be on her own. No more small town, no more puppy farm. Chapter 3. Back on the Farm. He was now 5 or 6 years old. His lonely life became even lonelier. He no longer had the weekly visits from that young girl. Her kind words and soft touch were enough to keep him going just a little bit longer. Where had she gone? Would she ever be back? He once again had no identity, unless the label ST5 on his cage meant something. Not to him. Now, the only contact he had with others was the constant barking and crying of the other dogs in the barn, none of which he had ever actually met, and that man that treated him so poorly when he had to do the breathing thing. It turns out that his name wasn't Creepy Guy, only the young girl called him that. Ned referred to him as Brad. Brad would be rough with him and yell at him every time he handled him. He thought it was funny to try to scare him, but he was never scared of Brad. He would bite him every chance he had. He would get slapped or thrown into his cage because of it, but he would never stop defending himself. Even though Brad was big and he was little, he knew Brad was afraid to reach into his cage. This gave him strength to go on. It was the only thing he had to look forward to. Even though Brad was rough with him, when he took him for the breeding thing, he looked forward to it because he got to stretch a little and see that there was something else outside there other than a cramped cage. What if one day he could get out and never be in a cage again? It gave him the will to survive. If only he could get there. Even though this was the only life he had ever known, he knew it wasn't right. It wasn't right to just sit all day. It wasn't right to poop in your own space and then have to sit in it all week. It wasn't right to have poop smeared and dried on his fur for months until it was sheared off. He knew no other life, but his instincts told him this was wrong. There was usually no light in the barn unless Ned or Brad were there. He could tell the difference between night and day, though, because the light coming through the cracks in the barn walls. This gave him a sense of time, but it all blurred together after a while. Minutes to hours, to days, to months, to years. He felt like he was getting weaker and running out of time. It was difficult to keep fighting when it was just to stay alive. Was that a good enough reason? It had to be. Brad would only show up every third day or so with food and water. He would have to open the cages and fill the bowls. As usual, when he came to the cage labeled ST5, he was apprehensive and tried to be as quick as possible. Today, little ST5 was feeling especially ornery. After the food and water were placed in his cage, he leaped forward and sunk his teeth into Brad's hand. Of course, he got slapped to the back of the cage, but it was worth it. Brad's hand was bleeding profusely, and he hurried to close the cage door and find some bandages for his wound. The cage had two latches on the door, one towards the top and the other close to the bottom. In Brad's haste, he forgot to secure the bottom latch. ST5 watched every detail of every move that Brad ever made. He saw the bottom of the cage door was slightly open. This was his chance. Because the cages were old, they were bent up a little bit. In order to close them properly, you had to push hard to line up the cage door properly with the latches. Because Brad hadn't secured the bottom latch, there was a gap a couple of inches wide. ST5's small stature may now be an asset. He went to the cage door and pushed his head between the cage door and the cage itself. The opening was narrow, but maybe he could squeeze through. He pushed as hard as he could and turned his head in different angles until his head popped out of the cage. Now all he had to do was get his front paws out and pull his body through. It wasn't going to be easy because the circumference of his rib cage was much bigger than his head. He eventually got both his front paws out and was able to use them to push against the cage and slowly pull his body out. The cage was about 3 feet above the floor, so he was going to drop once he was free. He knew that it didn't matter, though. As soon as he hit the floor, he would have to get out of the barn and run. He never had actually run before, but he was sure he could pull it off in a time like this. As he continued to push with his legs, he was able to start squeezing his body out. It was a tough going, though. Every fraction of an inch seemed like a mile. He felt like he was making some progress, but something was starting to hurt at a level even he hadn't experienced before. Apparently the old rusty cages had some sharp edges where the welds had come loose. One of those sharp edges was cutting into his back, just behind his shoulders, along his spine. The pain was incredible, but he couldn't stop now. This was his chance as he continued to fight to get free. The cage continued to dig into his skin. Every inch closer to freedom was accompanied by another inch cut into his back. He could now feel something wet running down his back. He must have been bleeding, but he welcomed it, because it seemed to act a little bit like lubricant, and he felt it was making a little bit more progress. He would need to slip out soon, because his strength was starting to diminish. He pushed as hard as he could and was making progress. His upper body was hanging out of the cage. All he had to do was get his last couple ribs clear, and he would fall to the ground. After his ribs, his lower body was much thinner and would be no problem. What he didn't realize was that his front legs could only push as far as they were long. He could no longer push off the cage because his legs weren't long enough. There was nothing more he could do. His blood was now starting to puddle on the floor in front of his cage, and he was stuck there. He could neither push himself out any further nor pull himself back in. So much hope, now despair. Brad never came back that day to finish feeding him. He knew it would be a couple of days before he would see anyone. Even though he hated Brad, he really wouldn't mind seeing him right now. He hung there for 3 days. The bleeding had stopped, but the pain never went away. When Brad showed up, he began to laugh. "Looks like you got what's coming to you, little shit," he yelled. He released ST5 from the grip of the cage door and put him back in his cage. ST5 didn't have enough strength to even try to bite Brad today. Not only had he lost a lot of blood, he had not had any food or water for at least 6 days. Brad did at least fill his food and water bowls, but that was it. There would be no caring for his wound, and so he knew better to eat and drink, or he wasn't going to survive. Things went back to normal, well, almost. Now, besides having poop stuck in his fur on the bottom half, he also had dried blood on his top half. He didn't or couldn't care about that. He must stay alert for any opportunities to escape. He had no idea what was beyond those barn walls, but it couldn't be worse than this. Slowly the pain went away, and it seemed that his wound had healed. He couldn't see or touch the wound, but it felt like it was about 5 inches long. That was about half the length of his back. It was time again for the breeding thing. This time it was almost a good thing because Ned always insisted that the long-haired breeds were shaved beforehand, before handling their poop-laden bodies. It was disgusting. It hurt a little to be shaved down because the trimmers would get stuck in the matted fur and pull, but at least the poop and the blood and the additional weight had to be gone for a while. After being trimmed, ST5's scar showed prominently. It was healed, but it looked red, and it still showed a little sore. "Brad, what the hell happened here?" said Ned in a tone that Brad recognized. It was a tone that suggested a straight answer was the only acceptable choice. He had tried to lie his way out of things before, and Ned always knew. This was a much more serious situation. "The little bastard tried to escape, Ned." "He tried to squeeze his way through the door of his cage. I caught him and put him back in the cage," Brad said sheepishly. "You would have had to have left one of the latches undone for him to have done that." Ned's voice was getting louder. "Do you know how much money I would have lost if he got away? That dog is worth more to me than you are. Remember that. I don't want to hear another word out of you today, Brad. Let's just get this done, and you can go home for the day." Brad knew to keep his mouth shut. End of chapter 3.